If you close your eyes and think back to the late 70s, you probably hear the bass line of a disco track, or maybe the murmur of a Walter Cronkite broadcast. You see gas lines, polyester suits, and big American sedans floating down the interstate. It was a loud era, a colorful era, but for millions of Americans, the defining memory of that time isn't a sound, it's a silence. A heavy, muffled, white silence that descended on the world and refused to leave. I'm talking about the winter of 1978. For those who were there, you don't just remember it, you feel it in your bones. It was the winter that didn't just snow, it attacked. It was the season where the sky turned a bruised purple-gray and dropped the ceiling on the American dream. We're talking about a weather event so severe it didn't just close schools, it closed entire states. It buried houses up to the eaves. It turned major interstates into graveyards of steel and chrome, freezing drivers where they sat. In the Midwest, they called it the White Hurricane. In New England, it was the storm of the century. But the geography matters less than the feeling. For a week in January, and then again in February, the relentless ticking clock of modern life simply stopped. There were no cell phones to call for help, no GPS to guide you home. If you were stuck, you were truly alone. And yet, in that isolation, something remarkable happened. As the snow piled up past the windowsills, the walls between neighbors dissolved. We stopped being commuters, employees, and consumers. We became survivors. Tonight, we aren't just looking at a weather map. We're digging back through the drifts to uncover a frozen moment in our history, a time when nature reminded us just how small we really are and how much we actually need each other when the heat goes out. To understand why 1978 hit us so hard, you have to look at the map, not the road map, but the weather map. And you have to look at it through the eyes of a forecaster in the late 70s. Back then, meteorology was still as much an art as it was a science. We didn't have supercomputers modeling 1,000 scenarios a minute. We didn't have 24-hour weather apps vibrating in our pockets to tell us to run for cover. We had the 6 o'clock news, a guy in a wide tie standing in front of a magnetic board, and a teletype machine chattering in the corner. The winter had already been brutal. The ground in the Midwest was frozen solid, acting like a concrete runway for whatever wind blew across it. But in late January, the atmosphere decided to do something rare, something violent. Two distinct low-pressure systems began a dance. One was a moisture-rich clip coming up from the Gulf of Mexico, heavy and wet. The other was an Arctic clipper diving down from Canada, cold and dry. Usually these two pass each other like strangers in the night. But on January 25th, over the Ohio Valley, they didn't pass. They merged. Meteorologists call it explosive cyclogenesis. It's a dry term for a terrifying event. The barometric pressure didn't just drop, it crashed. It fell so fast and so deep that it reached levels usually seen only in Category 3 hurricanes. It was an inland hurricane, a bomb cyclone before we had the buzzwords to describe it. On the ground, nobody saw the invisible collision happening miles above their heads. It was a Thursday morning. The factories in Ohio and Michigan were humming. School buses were picking up kids in Indiana. Commuters in Massachusetts were eyeing the calendar, waiting for the weekend. The forecast called for snow, maybe a few inches, a typical winter dusting. We went to work. We sent our kids to school. We drove our rear-wheel drive sedans onto the highways, armed with nothing but a scraper and a spare tire. We walked right into the trap. It didn't start with a whimper. It started with a roar that sounded like a freight train derailment happening directly overhead. In most blizzards, the snow piles up politely, inch by inch. But this was the great blizzard of '78. Within hours of that pressure drop, the wind speeds escalated from a stiff breeze to hurricane force. 70, 80, even 100 miles an hour in coastal Massachusetts and across the flat plains of Ohio. The snow wasn't falling down. It was driving horizontal, stinging exposed skin like buckshot. We call it a whiteout now, but that word feels too sterile for what happened that afternoon. The horizon simply vanished. The hood of your car vanished. The road in front of you ceased to exist. And then came the fatal mistake, the collective panic. Around 1 or 2 p.m., as the windows rattled in office towers in Boston, Cleveland, and Providence, bosses everywhere looked outside and said, "Go home." Governors declared states of emergency. Schools released early. It seemed like the prudent thing to do. In reality, it was the worst possible decision. Suddenly, millions of Americans poured onto the interstates and turnpikes simultaneously. They were driving heavy, rear-wheel drive sedans, Buicks, Oldsmobiles, Fords, cars that floated like boats on dry pavement, but handled like sleds on ice. On Route 128 outside Boston, on I-75 in Ohio, on the Long Island Expressway, the traffic slowed to a crawl. Then it stopped. An 18-wheeler would jackknife across 3 lanes, blinded by the snow. A station wagon would spin out, and behind them, the line of red taillights grew for miles. The snow didn't care about the traffic jam. It kept coming, 2 to 3 inches an hour. Drifts began to form around the tires, then the bumpers, then the door handles. The plows, the very machines meant to save us, were stuck in the same gridlock as the commuters. By late afternoon, the highways of the Northeast and Midwest weren't roads anymore. They were linear parking lots, rapidly turning into graveyards. The rise of the storm had outpaced our ability to run from it. We were no longer commuters trying to get home for dinner. We were refugees in our own vehicles. Night didn't fall that Tuesday so much as the world simply vanished. If you were lucky enough to be inside, you witnessed something that defied physics. You watched the snow climb the window pane, not inch by inch, but foot by foot. First the sill disappeared, then the lower sash. By midnight, on street corners from Providence to South Bend, families were staring at solid walls of white pressed against the glass on the second floor. Outside, the roar of the wind shifted into a high-pitched scream. This wasn't just a snowfall, it was a white hurricane. The barometric pressure had dropped lower than during the Great Hurricane of 1938. That vacuum sucked the warmth right out of the buildings. In Ohio, the wind chill hit 60 below zero. For those stranded on the highways, the experience shifted from frustration to a primal battle for survival. The engines died one by one. The heaters blew their last breath of warm air. And then the burial began. Survivors talk about the silence inside those cars. Once the engine cuts, the only sound is the granular hiss of ice pellets scouring the metal skin of the vehicle. You're sitting in a Buick Electra or a Ford LTD, 2 tons of American steel, and you feel small. You feel the car rocking violently in the 70-mile-per-hour gusts until the drifts rise high enough to cement you in place. Thousands of people spent that night huddled in vinyl seats, wrapped in newspapers, floor mats, or whatever spare clothing they had in the trunk. They were entombed in snowbanks that looked like rolling dunes. In some places, the drifts were 25 feet high. It was a sensory overload of cold and white. The landmarks we used to navigate our lives, the corner store, the fire hydrants, the street signs, were erased. The geography of the American Northeast and Midwest was reset to a blank slate. Inside the homes that still had power, television stations stayed on air for 24 hours straight, the anchors looking increasingly disheveled, reading messages from frantic relatives. To John in the blue Chevy on I-95, "Hold on, help is coming." But for most, the power lines had snapped hours ago under the weight of the ice. No furnace, no lights, just the creaking of the house reacting to the wind, and the eerie blue glow of a transistor radio, offering the only tether to a civilization that seemed to have completely collapsed. We were frozen in time, trapped in the amber of the storm. To understand the true terror of the Great Blizzard of '78, you can't just look at the thermometer, you have to look at the gas gauge. When that low-pressure system detonated over the Ohio Valley, it didn't just hit a country dealing with bad weather. It hit a country that was already running on fumes. This was the late '70s. The optimism of the space age had rusted out. We were deep in the malaise. We were post-Vietnam, post-Watergate, and smack in the middle of an energy crisis that had shaken the American psyche to its core. We were already shivering before the first flake fell. That winter, the United Mine Workers had launched one of the longest strikes in their history. In December of '77, over 160,000 miners walked off the job. By the time the blizzard hit in late January and early February, coal stockpiles at power plants were critically low. In states like Indiana and Ohio, electricity wasn't a guarantee, it was a luxury being rationed. Governors were already on television begging families to dial their thermostats down to 65, then 60, then 55 degrees. Schools were closing not because of snow, but because they couldn't afford to heat the classrooms. Factories, the heartbeat of the Rust Belt economy, were cutting shifts to save power. So when the grid actually failed under the weight of the ice, it felt like a prophecy fulfilled. It felt like the final nail in the coffin of American industrial invincibility. You have to remember the infrastructure we were relying on, the power lines, the plows, the emergency response systems, was built for the boom times of the '50s. It was aging, it was brittle, and suddenly it was being asked to withstand a 100-year storm while fueled by a scarcity economy. The psychological toll was heavy. We were the superpower that had put a man on the moon less than a decade earlier. Yet here we were, unable to plow a street in Boston or keep the lights on in Cleveland. The storm stripped away the illusion of control. It revealed that for all our nuclear might and geopolitical sway, we were still at the mercy of the elements, and our systems were far more fragile than we dared to admit. The snow didn't just bury our cars, it buried our confidence. It forced a reckoning between the government and the governed. We looked to the state for salvation, for the National Guard, for the plows, but the scale of the disaster simply swallowed the bureaucracy whole. Tuesday morning began as a gray, wet commute, just rain. By the afternoon rush hour, the temperature plummeted, the rain turned to ice, and then the heavy snow began to fall sideways. This is the moment the world tilted. This is where the blizzard of '78 stopped being a weather event and became a siege. The transformation was most violent on the highways. Route 128 outside Boston, I-75 in Ohio, the Long Island Expressway. These arteries of American commerce, usually flowing at 65 miles per hour, sclerosed instantly. Thousands of workers leaving their shifts, trying to beat the storm home, found themselves driving into a white wall. Visors down, wipers slapping frantically against the windshield, heaters blasting. It wasn't enough. The snow was falling at an inch, sometimes 2 inches, an hour. Drifts were forming faster than tires could cut through them. And then, the engine stopped. Imagine the psychology of that moment. You are in your car, your steel bubble of autonomy. It's a Ford LTD or a Chevy Impala, a symbol of freedom. And suddenly, it's a trap. Drivers sat there, idling, watching the snow creep up the door panels, then the windows. The familiar landmarks, the exit signs, the billboards, the guardrails, were being erased in real time. The landscape itself was being rewritten. The distinct geometry of the suburbs, driveways, sidewalks, curbs, vanished under a uniform, undulating blanket of white. The world lost its edges. You couldn't tell where the road ended and the ditch began. Inside those buried cars, the mood shifted from annoyance to genuine fear. The radio stations, which had been playing the Bee Gees or Billy Joel, switched to emergency broadcasts, but the voices sounded distant, confused. The terrifying realization set in. The tow trucks weren't coming. The police cruisers were stuck just like you. The hierarchy of the highway dissolved. It didn't matter if you were driving a Cadillac or a beat-up delivery van. The storm was the great equalizer. We went from a society of motion to a society of total, frozen stasis. The roar of the American machine was replaced by a suffocating, white silence, broken only by the wind howling through the gaps in the window seals. If the highways were the arteries of the American organism, the power grid was its nervous system. And as Tuesday night bled into a gray, unrecognizable Wednesday, that nervous system began to shut down. You have to remember the backdrop. This was 1978. The country was already shivering through an energy crisis. We were in the middle of a massive coal strike. President Carter had been on television wearing a cardigan, telling us to turn down our thermostats to 65 degrees. We were a nation already anxious about running out of juice. Then the ice moved in. It wasn't just the weight of the snow, it was the wind. Gusts hit hurricane force, 70, 80, even 100 miles an hour on the coast. It screamed through the utility easements, snapping power lines like dry spaghetti. Transformers exploded with brilliant blue-green flashes, illuminating the swirling white for a split second before plunging entire counties into darkness. This was the beginning of the end for the illusion of control. In the suburbs of Providence, Cleveland, and Boston, the furnaces went silent. The electric clocks stopped. The hum of the refrigerator died. For a generation raised on the promise of post-war reliability, where the flip of a switch guaranteed light, this was a profound shock. But the real decline wasn't on a balance sheet. It was happening in those snowbound homes and stranded cars. Hypothermia is a quiet killer. It doesn't announce itself with drama. It's a slow drowsiness. As the interior temperatures of homes dropped into the 40s and 30s, the crisis shifted from a logistical nightmare to a humanitarian emergency. Realized they were outmatched. The plows were broken or buried. The police were immobilized. The standard civic machinery, the mayors, the road crews, the local cops, had collapsed under the weight of the storm. Governors declared states of emergency, effectively admitting defeat. They did something rare in American history. They closed entire states. It became illegal to drive. The logic of capitalism, get to work, earn a wage, keep moving, was suspended by executive order. The storm had broken the back of the daily grind. When the official machinery of the state grinds to a halt, something remarkable happens in America. The silence of the shut-down highways was quickly filled by a different kind of noise. It was the sound of a society improvising its own survival. If you were stuck in a drift on Route 128 or buried in a farmhouse in Ohio, your lifeline wasn't a smartphone or a GPS signal. It was a metal box with a coil cord microphone, the Citizens Band radio. 1978 was the peak of the CB craze. It had started with truckers, but by the time the blizzard hit, suburban dads and teenagers had them installed in their dash or set up as base stations in the den. When the telephone lines snapped under the ice, the airwaves crackled to life. It was the pre-digital internet, a chaotic, noisy, vital network of strangers coordinating rescues in the dark. You'd hear voices cutting through the static, channeling emergency supplies, or guiding the National Guard to stranded motorists. Breaker 19 wasn't just pop culture slang anymore, it was a distress call. And then there were the snowmobiles. Before the storm, they were just recreational toys for the weekend. But when the plows failed, the snowmobile became the only viable ambulance in the Northeast. You saw doctors being taxied to hospitals on the backs of Arctic cats and Polaris sleds. You saw bread and milk being run to shut-ins by teenagers in snowsuits. The police, unable to move their cruisers, actually commandeered these machines or deputized their owners. The highway, illegal to drive on, became a snowmobile freeway. Inside the homes, the social contract was being rewritten. The blizzard dissolved the boundaries of privacy that usually define suburban life. If your neighbor had a wood stove and you didn't, you moved in. It was that simple. There was a distinct lack of panic. In its place was a grim, determined cheerfulness. We were cold, we were in the dark, and we didn't know when the plows were coming back. But for a few days, nobody was alone. The blizzard had buried the roads, but it had dug up a sense of community that many people hadn't realized was missing until the lights went out. In the weeks and months that followed, as the drifts turned into gray slush and the buried cars were finally towed away, the blizzard of '78 ceased to be a weather event and solidified into American folklore. First came the legends, some true, some exaggerated. The most enduring myth was the so-called blizzard baby boom. The story went that 9 months after the power went out and the roads closed, hospitals from Boston to Cleveland saw a spike in maternity ward admissions. Whether the statistics fully back it up is almost beside the point. Culturally, we decided it was true. It fit the narrative. Nature shut us down, so we turned to each other. But the storm left a more tangible mark on our media landscape. Before 1978, the local weatherman was often a jovial character in a loud suit, standing in front of a magnetic map. After 1978, weather became serious business. The blizzard invented the modern concept of storm-team coverage. Television stations realized that weather wasn't just small talk. It was a matter of life and death, and frankly, it was ratings gold. The French toast alert, the panic buying of milk, bread, and eggs, became a ritual enshrined in the local news cycle, born directly from the trauma of those empty supermarket shelves in February. Politically, the snow changed the rules of engagement. In Massachusetts, Governor Michael Dukakis famously went on television wearing a cardigan sweater to deliver updates. It was an image that projected distinct, unpretentious leadership, a visual that said, "I'm cold, you're cold, let's get through this." Conversely, mayors and officials who failed to get the plows moving fast enough found their careers buried in the snowbanks. The blizzard taught every American politician a lesson they still hold dear today. You can survive a scandal, but you cannot survive an unplowed street. For the generation that lived through it, the blizzard of '78 became the ultimate yardstick. It became the "I walked uphill both ways" story for the late 20th century. Every snowfall since has been measured against it, and almost all have been found wanting. It gave us a collective badge of honor. You weren't just a resident of the snowbelt, you were a survivor of the white hurricane. We bought the t-shirts, we saved the newspapers, and we bored our children with the stories. Today, the ambush of 1978 seems almost impossible to replicate. We have traded the mystery of the atmosphere for the certainty of the algorithm. Our infrastructure has evolved from brute force to chemical warfare. We don't just wait for the snow to fall and then push it around. Departments of transportation now pre-treat the interstates with brine and magnesium chloride days before the first flake lands. The plows themselves are guided by GPS, turning snow removal into a data-driven logistical operation. We are hyper-prepared, hyper-aware, and frankly, hyper-anxious. The media landscape that was born in the wake of '78 has metastasized. We now name winter storms like hurricanes, giving them personalities and marketing campaigns. The 24-hour news cycle demands a constant feed of adrenaline, turning every 3-inch dusting into the storm of the century until the viewing public becomes numb to the warnings. Today, technology has stolen that stillness from us. The snow day, that sacred American institution of unexpected freedom, is on the endangered species list. When the roads are impassable today, we don't break out the Monopoly board, we log into Zoom. We pivot to remote learning and work from home. The connectivity that saves us from being stranded also ensures we are never truly off the clock. We have conquered the isolation of the blizzard, but in doing so, we lost the permission to pause. We look back at the photos of 1978, the buried highways, the tunneling commuters, and it looks like a different planet. A colder, slower, more dangerous, yet strangely simpler world. We tell ourselves we are smarter now. We tell ourselves we have tamed the season. When we zoom out from the specific misery of 1978, past the stranded motorists on Route 128, past the collapsed roof of the Hartford Civic Center, and past the shivering families in coastal Massachusetts, we start to see the blizzard for what it really was. It wasn't just a meteorological anomaly. It was a massive, involuntary audit of the American experiment. We spend so much of our lives building structures designed to insulate us from the wild. We pave the earth, we condition the air, we ensure the property. We convince ourselves that civilization is a fortress. But for 3 days in February of 1978, the wind blew the fortress down. The storm stripped away the veneer of the late 20th century and revealed something much older and much more fundamental. It revealed that despite our industrial might, we are still tenants on this planet, not landlords. The snow didn't care about your tax bracket. It didn't care if you drove a rusted-out Pinto or a brand-new Cadillac Eldorado. Both were equally useless when the drifts hit 6 feet. The storm was the great equalizer. It flattened the social hierarchy just as effectively as it flattened the landscape. In that whiteout, the artificial barriers between us dissolved. The atomization of American society, that drift towards suburban isolation that had been happening since the 1950s, suddenly reversed. You couldn't survive 78 as an individual. You had to survive it as a neighborhood. We talk about the hardship, but there is a reason the survivors speak of those days with a strange, paradoxical fondness. For a brief moment, the noise of the world stopped. The politics, the inflation, the Cold War anxiety, it all got buried under the powder. All that mattered was heat, food, and the person standing next to you. The blizzard of 78 proved that underneath the consumerism and the rush of modern life, the bedrock of community was still there. It showed us that when the grid fails and the plow doesn't come, we are capable of profound acts of unexpected grace. Strangers sharing kerosene, teenagers delivering milk on sleds to the elderly, commuters walking miles in waist-deep snow to lead others to safety. It was a reminder that resilience isn't something you buy at a hardware store. It's a muscle. And in 1978, America flexed it. We learned that while we cannot control the sky, we can control how we treat each other when the sky falls.